The dust kicked up from the cattle drive still clung to Thomas McKenna's weathered boots as he walked through the streets of Fort Worth. It was September 1878, and the town buzzed with more activity than usual. Thomas had just sold his herd of longhorn cattle after 3 months on the trail, and his pockets jingled with the coins that would keep his ranch running through the winter. At 34 years old, Thomas was a man shaped by hard work and loss. His calloused hands told stories of mending fences and birthing calves, while the lines around his eyes spoke of too many sunrises spent alone. 3 years had passed since fever took his wife, and the loneliness of his remote ranch sometimes felt heavier than the work itself. He planned to buy supplies and head home before dark, but the crowd gathering near the courthouse caught his attention. People pressed together, their voices mixing into an excited buzz that made Thomas uneasy. He'd seen crowds like this before, and they rarely meant anything good. "What's all the fuss about?" Thomas asked the blacksmith, who was wiping his hands on a dirty apron. "Government's got some Comanche prisoners they're selling off," the man said with a shrug. "Captured them after that raid near San Antonio last month. Figure folks can put them to work instead of keeping them locked up." Thomas felt his stomach turn. He knew about these auctions. They called it indentured servitude now, but it looked the same as the slave auctions he remembered from before the war. The fact that these were Native Americans instead of African Americans didn't make it sit any better with him, despite his better judgment. Thomas found himself walking toward the crowd. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something deeper pulled him forward. He pushed through the gathered people until he could see the wooden platform that served as an auction block. The first person brought up was an elderly Comanche man. His back was straight despite his age, and his eyes held a dignity that the chains around his wrists couldn't break. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like a carnival barker, started the bidding at $50. "This one's good for basic farm work," the auctioneer called out. "Strong as an ox and knows his place." Thomas watched as hands shot up around him. A farmer from outside town won the bid at $85. The old man was led away without changing his expression, but Thomas saw his hands shake slightly. As the new owner approached him, next came a young woman, maybe 20 years old. She kept her eyes on the ground as men called out bids like she was a piece of livestock. Thomas noticed how some of the bidders looked at her, and it made his jaw clench. She sold for $120 to a saloon owner whose reputation made Thomas's skin crawl. One by one, families were separated. Children cried for parents who were led away in different directions. Brothers and sisters were split up and sold to bidders scattered across 3 counties. Each sale felt like a punch to Thomas's gut, but he couldn't look away. Then they brought her up. The Comanche woman was clearly with child, her belly round and full beneath the simple dress someone had given her. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and despite her condition, she moved with a grace that spoke of strength. Thomas could see she was struggling. Her face was pale, and she swayed slightly on her feet. The auctioneer grinned as he gestured toward her. "Now here's a fine specimen. Young, healthy, and you're getting 2 for the price of 1 if you catch my meaning." The crowd laughed at his crude joke, and Thomas felt heat rise in his chest. "She's good for housework, cooking, and whatever else you might need," the man continued with a wink that made several bidders chuckle. "And that baby will grow up to be useful too. Start the bidding at $75. The pregnant woman lifted her head and looked out over the crowd. Her dark eyes were fierce despite her circumstances, and Thomas found himself unable to look away. There was something in those eyes that reminded him of a wild horse he'd once tried to break. Beautiful, proud, and undefeated even in captivity, the bidding started slowly. Most men seemed put off by her pregnancy, viewing it as a complication rather than the bonus the auctioneer had advertised. But a few hands went up, including one from a man Thomas recognized as Garrett Hutchins. Hutchins was a merchant who'd moved to Fort Worth the year before. He dealt in goods of questionable origin and had a reputation for treating his workers poorly. Thomas had heard stories about the man's temper and his particular cruelty toward anyone he considered beneath him. $90, Hutchins called out. His voice cutting through the crowd. The pregnant woman's gaze fell on Hutchins, and Thomas saw something flicker across her face. Fear? Recognition? Whatever it was quickly replaced by defiance, as she straightened her shoulders. 95, came another voice from the back. 100. Hutchins countered immediately. The bidding continued in small increments until it reached $130. Most of the other bidders dropped out, leaving just Hutchins and a rancher from the next county over. Thomas found himself hoping the rancher would win. He'd heard the man was decent enough, treated his workers fairly, but Hutchins wasn't giving up. 150, he declared loudly. The rancher shook his head and stepped back. Hutchins had won. Sold to Mr. Hutchins for $150, the auctioneer announced. Come on up and claim your property. Hutchins pushed through the crowd with a satisfied smirk on his face. As he climbed the steps to the platform, the pregnant woman took a small step backward. The movement was subtle, but Thomas caught it. She was afraid of this man. Well, Hutchins said as he approached her. Looks like you're coming home with me, sweetheart. The woman said nothing, but her chin lifted slightly in a gesture of defiance that seemed to irritate Hutchins immediately. I said you're coming. With me, he repeated, louder this time. When I talk to you, you answer. Do you understand? Still, she remained silent. The crowd began to murmur, some amused by the confrontation, others growing uncomfortable. Hutchins's face reddened. I just paid good money for you, and you'll show me the respect I deserve. He grabbed her arm roughly, and she winced. That's when she stumbled. Maybe it was the stress of the situation, or maybe the baby was making it hard for her to keep her balance. Whatever the reason, she took a step back and her foot caught the edge of a loose board. She swayed, her free hand going to her belly as she tried to steady herself. Hutchins saw it as defiance. You think you're too good to answer me? He snarled. His hand came up fast, connecting with her cheek in a sharp crack that echoed across the suddenly quiet crowd. The pregnant woman fell to her knees. Her hand pressed to her face where a red mark was already forming. For a moment, the entire square was silent except for the sound of her labored breathing. Something exploded inside Thomas McKenna. Later, he wouldn't remember making the decision to move. One moment he was standing in the crowd, and the next he was charging up the steps of the platform. His boots thundered against the wooden planks as he crossed the distance between himself and Hutchins in 3 long strides. Hutchins turned at the sound, his mouth opening to say something, but Thomas's fist connected with his jaw before any words could come out. The merchant dropped like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. The crowd erupted in shouts and chaos. Some people pushed forward to get a better look, while others backed away from the violence. The auctioneer was yelling something about maintaining order, but Thomas couldn't hear him over the blood pounding in his ears. He knelt beside the fallen woman, who was staring up at him with wide, confused eyes. Are you hurt? He asked gently, though he doubted she understood English. She shook her head slightly, her hand still pressed to her cheek. Thomas helped her to her feet, and she leaned against him for support. He could feel her trembling. This is highly irregular, the auctioneer was saying. Mr. Hutchins has already paid for her. You can't just— How much? Thomas interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise. I beg your pardon? How much for her freedom? Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather pouch that held his cattle money. Name your price. The auctioneer looked nervous. Hutchins was starting to stir on the ground, groaning and holding his jaw. The crowd was getting restless, and the sheriff was pushing his way through the people toward the platform. Well, Mr. Hutchins paid $150, the auctioneer said hesitantly. Thomas dumped the contents of his pouch into his palm. $800 in gold coins and paper money. Everything he'd earned from months of hard work, his ranch money, his winter survival fund. He looked down at the pregnant woman beside him. She was watching him with those fierce, dark eyes, and something in them reminded him why he'd acted in the first place. This wasn't about money or property or even justice. This was about seeing another human being treated with basic dignity. $800, Thomas said loudly, holding up the money for everyone to see. I'll give you $800 for her freedom. Not to own her, but to set her free. The crowd fell silent again. $800 was more money than most of these people saw in a year. It was certainly more than anyone expected to. Pay for a single person at auction. The auctioneer's eyes went wide. 800 for her? For her freedom, Thomas corrected firmly. She goes free, no owner, no master, no nothing. She's a free woman. By now. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled out of Fort Worth, leaving behind the dust and noise of the town. Thomas had managed to buy basic supplies with the few coins he found in his saddlebags, but his heart was heavy knowing his ranch fund was completely gone. Still, every time he glanced back at the Comanche woman sitting quietly in the wagon bed, he felt the same certainty that he'd done the right thing. She hadn't spoken since they left the auction. Thomas had tried to explain where they were going, using gestures and simple words, but she just watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, and he could see she was uncomfortable from the way she shifted position every few minutes. The first day passed slowly. Thomas kept the horses at an easy pace, not wanting to jar her too much. She was clearly very pregnant, and the rough wagon ride couldn't be good for her or the baby. When they stopped at midday to rest the horses, he offered her water and some bread he'd bought in town. She accepted the water gratefully, but looked at the bread with suspicion. Thomas realized she probably hadn't eaten much good food in months, maybe longer. He tried to encourage her by taking a bite himself and nodding, but she only ate a small piece before stopping. "It's good," Thomas said, pointing to the bread. "Food? Eat." She studied his face for a moment, then surprised him by repeating the word in her accented voice. "Eat?" Thomas smiled and nodded. "Yes, eat. You need to eat for the baby." He pointed to her belly and she looked down at it, then back at him. For the first time since he'd met her, something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas tried to learn more words. He pointed to himself and said, "Thomas," several times until she seemed to understand it was his name. Then he pointed to her questioningly. She hesitated for a long moment before touching her chest and saying something that sounded like, "Ayana, Ayana." Thomas repeated and she nodded. It was a beautiful name, though he had no idea what it meant. That evening they made camp beside a small creek. Thomas had blankets in the wagon, and he made a comfortable spot for Ayana under the canvas cover while he prepared to sleep on the ground beside the fire. She watched him work, and when he handed her an extra blanket, she said something in her own language that he was pretty sure meant "thank you." The second day started much the same, but Thomas noticed Ayana seemed more restless. She kept shifting in the wagon bed, and several times he heard her make small sounds of discomfort. When they stopped for the midday break, she struggled to climb down from the wagon. Thomas quickly moved to help her, and she leaned on his arm more heavily than she had the day before. Her face was pale, and there were tiny beads of sweat on her forehead despite the cool autumn air. "Are you feeling sick?" he asked, though he knew she wouldn't understand most of the words. She looked at him and placed both hands on her belly, then made a gesture that looked like waves. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He'd helped enough animals give birth to recognize the signs, and everything about Ayana's behavior suggested the baby was coming soon. They were still a full day's ride from his ranch, and there wasn't a town or even a neighbor's house within 20 miles. If the baby decided to come now, they'd be on their own. Thomas tried to stay calm as they continued down the trail, but he kept glancing back at Ayana. She was gripping the side of the wagon now, and her breathing had changed. Every bump in the road made her wince. By late afternoon, dark clouds were building on the horizon. Thomas could smell rain in the air, and the wind was picking up. The last thing they needed was to be caught in a storm with Ayana in labor. He remembered passing an old abandoned cabin about a mile back. It had looked run down, but it would be better shelter than the open wagon if the weather turned bad. Thomas made the difficult decision to turn around and head back to the cabin. "We're going to stop for the night," he told Ayana, though he wasn't sure how much she understood. "There's shelter ahead." She nodded, but he could see she was struggling now. Her hands were clenched, and she was breathing in short, quick breaths. The cabin was in worse shape than Thomas had hoped. The roof had holes, One wall was partially collapsed, and animals had clearly been using it as shelter. But it was better than being out in the open, and there was even an old stone fireplace that looked like it might still work. Thomas helped Ayana down from the wagon just as the first drops of rain began to fall. She could barely walk now, and when another pain hit her, she grabbed his arm so tightly he thought she might break it. "The baby's coming, isn't it?" he said, though it wasn't really a question. Ayana looked at him with frightened eyes and nodded. Then she doubled over as another contraction hit her. Thomas had delivered plenty of calves and foals, but he'd never helped with a human birth. His own wife had died before they could have children, so he had no experience with this at all. But Ayana was looking at him with such trust in her eyes that he knew he had to try. He quickly unhitched the horses and brought them into the partially collapsed part of the cabin where they'd be sheltered from the rain. Then he gathered all the blankets and supplies he could find and made a clean area near the fireplace. The storm hit just as he got a fire started. Rain poured through the holes in the roof and lightning lit up the sky. Thunder crashed overhead, making the old cabin shake. Ayana was having contractions every few minutes now. She tried to stay quiet, but Thomas could see she was in serious pain. He knelt beside her and took her hand, trying to offer what comfort he could. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "The baby will be here soon and everything will be fine." She squeezed his hand and said something in Comanche. Her voice was strained, but there was determination in it. As the hours passed, Thomas did his best to help. He brought her water, adjusted the blankets to keep her comfortable, and stayed by her side. The storm raged outside, but inside the little cabin, they worked together through each contraction. Ayana was incredibly strong. Even in the midst of labor, she tried to help Thomas understand what she needed. She showed him how to support her back, and when the pain got really bad, she gripped his hands and looked into his eyes like she was drawing strength from him. Around midnight, things started happening fast. Ayana's contractions were coming, one right after another, and Thomas could tell the baby was ready to be born. He'd never been so scared in his life, but he couldn't let Ayana see that. "You're doing great," he told her, smoothing her hair back from her sweaty forehead. "Just keep breathing." And then suddenly the baby was there. A tiny, perfect little boy who came into the world crying loudly enough to be heard over the thunder. Thomas caught him carefully, his hands shaking as he wrapped the baby in a clean blanket. Ayana was exhausted but alert, reaching for her son with tears streaming down her face. Thomas placed the baby in her arms and she held him close, whispering words in Comanche that sounded like prayers or blessings. The baby quieted when he heard his mother's voice. He was small but seemed healthy, with a thick head of dark hair and strong lungs. Ayana looked up at Thomas with such gratitude that he felt his own eyes fill with tears. "He's beautiful," Thomas said softly. "You did amazing." Ayana understood the tone, if not the words. She smiled through her exhaustion and said something that sounded like the baby's name. It took Thomas a moment to realize she was saying Dakota. "Dakota," he repeated, and she nodded. As the storm began to calm outside, Thomas built up the fire and made sure both mother and baby were warm and comfortable. Ayana was able to feed the baby, and both of them seemed to be doing well. Thomas sat back and watched them in the flickering firelight. Just 2 days ago, he'd been a lonely rancher heading home with his cattle money. Now he was sharing a broken-down cabin with a Comanche woman and her newborn son, and somehow it felt right. He'd helped bring new life into the world on one of the wildest nights he'd ever experienced. As he listened to Ayana singing softly to baby Dakota, Thomas realized that something had changed in him too. These weren't strangers anymore. Somehow, in the space of one stormy night, they'd become something like family. When morning came, the storm had passed and sunlight streamed through the holes in the roof. Ayana was tired but alert, and baby Dakota was sleeping peacefully in her arms. They'd all survived the night, and Thomas felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he'd ever experienced. As he prepared the wagon for the final day of travel to his ranch, Thomas knew their real journey was just beginning. He had no idea what would happen when they reached his home, but he was certain of one thing: He would do everything in his power to protect both Ayana and her son. The auction in Fort Worth felt like a lifetime ago. Now, as they prepared to start their new life together, Thomas couldn't imagine how empty his world had been before these two extraordinary people came into it. The McKenna Ranch sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, with a small creek running behind the house. It wasn't much to look at, a simple wooden house, a barn that needed repairs, and fences that had seen better days. But as Thomas helped Ayana down from the wagon, he saw her looking around with what seemed like relief. After months in military prisons and slave markets, even his humble ranch must have looked like freedom. Baby Dakota had slept most of the final day's journey, but now he was awake and fussing. Ayana looked exhausted, still recovering from giving birth just 2 days earlier. Thomas knew she needed rest, good food, and a safe place to heal. "This is home," he said, gesturing toward the house. He repeated the word slowly. "Home." Ayana looked at him with uncertainty. She said something in Comanche that he didn't understand, but her tone sounded like a question. Thomas realized she didn't know what he expected from her. Was she a guest? A servant? Something else? He needed to make his intentions clear, even though they could barely communicate. He opened the front door and stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter first. The inside of the house was simple, but clean. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms. Thomas had been living alone for 3 years, and it showed. The place was practical but had no warmth or personal touches. Thomas. Led Ayana to the larger bedroom, the one he'd shared with his late wife. He pointed to the bed and then to her. "Your room," he said. "You sleep here." Ayana shook her head and backed away, speaking rapidly in Comanche. She seemed upset by the idea. Thomas realized she might think he was expecting something from her. In return for his help. He quickly shook his head and held up his hands. "No, no," he said firmly. "Just sleep, rest, safe." He pointed to himself, then toward the barn outside. "I sleep there." Understanding dawned in Ayana's eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out why a man would give up his own bed for a stranger. Finally, she nodded and said something that sounded grateful. Thomas brought in her few belongings and made sure she had everything she needed. Fresh water, clean blankets, and some food from his limited supplies. Baby Dakota was crying again, and Ayana looked overwhelmed. Over the next few days, Thomas tried to make them both comfortable while keeping his distance. He slept in the barn and came to the house only for meals and to check on them. Ayana spent most of her time resting and caring for Dakota, slowly regaining her strength. Communication remained difficult, but they began to develop a system. Thomas would point to objects and say their English names. Ayana would sometimes repeat them, and occasionally she would teach him words in Comanche. The word for water was baya. Baby was baya-ish. Thank you was ora. Ora, Ayana said one morning when Thomas brought her fresh eggs from his chickens. "You're welcome," he replied, then repeated it slowly so she could learn as the days passed. Ayana began to move around the house more. Thomas would come in from working on the ranch to find that she'd cleaned something or prepared food. She was clearly trying to contribute, but he worried she was pushing herself too hard so soon after giving birth. "Rest," he would tell her, gesturing toward the bedroom. "You need rest." But Ayana was proud and strong. She didn't want to be helpless. One day, Thomas came in to find her struggling to carry a heavy pot of water. When he tried to help, she waved him away and said something sharp in Comanche. Thomas stepped back, understanding. She needed to feel useful, not like a burden. From then on, he let her help with light tasks around the house while making sure she didn't overdo it. Their first real breakthrough came about 2 weeks after they arrived at the ranch. Thomas was trying to fix a broken chair when he noticed Ayana watching him. He was clearly doing it wrong, and the chair kept falling apart. Ayana said something and gestured toward the chair. When Thomas looked confused, she held out her hand for the tools. Apparently someone in her tribe had taught her about woodworking. Working together, they fixed the chair properly. It was the first time they'd collaborated on something, and Thomas was impressed by her skill and knowledge. When they finished, they both smiled, and Thomas felt like they'd crossed some kind of barrier. "Good work," he said, and she seemed to understand the praise. Baby Dakota was growing fast and becoming more alert. Thomas found himself drawn to the little boy, who would watch him with curious dark eyes. Sometimes when Ayana was busy, Thomas would hold Dakota and talk to him in English. "Your mama's a strong woman," he would tell the baby. "You're lucky to have her." Ayana seemed to appreciate Thomas's gentle way with her son. She began to trust him with Dakota for short periods, and Thomas treasured those moments. He'd never had children of his own, and holding the baby filled an empty space in his heart he hadn't even realized was there. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Ayana began to tell Thomas her story. She spoke mostly in Comanche, but she mixed in English words she'd learned, and Thomas began to piece together what had happened to her. She drew pictures in the dirt by the fireplace. A village, many people. Then soldiers on horses, fighting, fire. She pointed to herself and drew a man beside her, her husband, Thomas realized. Then she crossed out the man and touched her belly. Her husband had been killed in the raid where she was captured, and she'd been pregnant with his child. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest as he imagined what she'd been through. Losing her home, her husband, her freedom, all while carrying a baby? The strength it must have taken to survive all that amazed him. "I'm sorry," he said softly. He didn't know the Comanche words, but he hoped his tone conveyed his sympathy. Ayana nodded and said something that included the word "Ura," thank you. She was thanking him for listening, for caring. Then Thomas told her about his own loss. He pointed to the bedroom and drew a picture of a woman in the dirt, his wife. Then he drew a picture of fever, someone lying sick in bed. He crossed out the woman's picture and touched his own chest, trying to show how much it had hurt. Ayana understood. They'd both lost the people they loved. They'd both been alone. Now they were sharing their loneliness and somehow making it easier to bear. As October turned into November, their communication improved rapidly. Ayana was smart and picked up English quickly, while Thomas learned more Comanche words every day. They developed a mixture of both languages, gestures, and drawings that worked well enough for daily life. The routine they'd established was comfortable. Thomas would wake early and do the ranch work, feeding animals, repairing fences, checking on the cattle. Ayana would care for Dakota and manage the house. In the evenings, they would share meals and continue their language lessons, but their peaceful life was about to be interrupted. One cold morning in late November, Thomas saw riders approaching the ranch. 3 men on horseback moving fast. As they got closer, he recognized the lead rider and felt his stomach drop. Garrett Hutchins had found them. The merchant looked angry and determined as he rode up to the house with 2 other men Thomas didn't recognize. They were armed and looked like the type of men who would do anything for money. Thomas stepped outside to meet them, making sure to stay between the riders and the house where Ayana was inside with Dakota. Well, Hutchins said, his voice full of fake friendliness. "If it isn't the hero from Fort Worth, I hear you've been playing house with my property." "She's not your property," Thomas said calmly. "I bought her freedom, remember? You were there." Hutchins laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Freedom? That was just a fancy word you used to steal what was rightfully mine. That Comanche woman belongs to me, and I've come to collect her." "You sold her to me fair and square," Thomas replied. "I have the papers to prove it." "Papers can be challenged," one of the other men said, "especially when they involve Indians. Courts don't much care about Indian rights." Thomas felt his anger building, but he kept his voice steady. "What do you want, Hutchins?" "I want what's mine, the woman and the baby." "You can keep your precious freedom papers. They're not worth the paper they're written on." At that moment, Ayana appeared in the doorway of the house. She was holding Dakota, and Thomas could see fear in her eyes as she recognized Hutchins. She said something in Comanche that sounded like a warning. "There she is," Hutchins said with satisfaction. "Come here, woman, we're going home." Ayana stepped back into the house and closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking was loud in the cold air. Thomas moved closer to his own horse, where he kept a rifle. "She's not going anywhere with you." "Now, don't do anything stupid," Hutchins said, but his hand moved to his gun. "There are 3 of us and 1 of you. Just hand over the woman and we'll be on our way." "Over my dead body?" Thomas said quietly. The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Thomas could hear Dakota crying inside the house, and he knew Ayanna was terrified. These men had the law on their side, or thought they did. Even if Thomas was legally right, he was outnumbered and outgunned, but sometimes being right was more important than being safe. "You've got until tomorrow morning to think about it," Hutchins said finally. "We'll be camping by the creek. If you don't bring her out by sunrise, we'll come and take her ourselves." That night was the longest of Thomas's life. He sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching for any sign of movement in the darkness. Ayanna had barely spoken since Hutchins left, and baby Dakota seemed to sense the tension because he kept crying no matter what she did to comfort him. Around midnight, Ayanna came out of the bedroom carrying Dakota. She'd been trying to get him to sleep, but the baby was too upset. She sat down across from Thomas, and they looked at each other in the dim light from the dying fire. "He wants to take me back," she said quietly. Her English had improved so much over the past months that they could have real conversations now. Thomas nodded. "He thinks he owns you, but he's wrong. What if he has papers? What if the law says he's right?" Ayanna's voice was filled with worry. Thomas had been thinking about the same thing. The truth was, he didn't know much about legal matters. All he had was the receipt from the auction showing he'd paid for her freedom. But courts in Texas weren't known for being fair to Native Americans, and Hutchins might have friends in high places. "We'll figure it out," Thomas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then she said something that surprised him. "Maybe I should go with him." "What?" Thomas nearly dropped his rifle. "You can't be serious." If I don't go, he might hurt you. He might hurt Dakota." Tears were starting to form in her eyes. "I've already caused you so much trouble. You spent all your money to help me, and now this man wants to fight you because of me." Thomas set his rifle aside and moved closer to her. "Listen to me, Ayanna. You didn't cause any trouble. Hutchins caused trouble by being a cruel man who thinks he can own other people. And I'm not letting him take you anywhere." "But why?" she asked, looking directly into his eyes. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas had been asking himself the same thing for weeks. Why had he spent his life savings on a stranger? Why was he willing to fight armed men to protect her? Why did the thought of her leaving make his chest feel tight? The answer was simple, but saying it out loud felt like jumping off a cliff. "Because I love you," Thomas said quietly. Ayanna stared at him, and Thomas immediately worried he'd said the wrong thing. They came from different worlds? Different cultures? Maybe she didn't feel the same way. Maybe he just made everything more complicated, but then Ayanna smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "I love you too," she whispered. Thomas felt his heart skip. "You do? How could I not love the man who saved my life? Who helped me bring my son into the world? Who treats me like I'm worth something?" Ayanna reached out and took his hand. "You showed me kindness when I thought the world had no kindness left." They sat there holding hands while baby Dakota finally fell asleep in his mother's arms. For a few minutes, Thomas forgot about Hutchins and his threats. All that mattered was this moment with the woman he loved and the child who'd become like his own son. But dawn was coming, and with it would come decisions that could change everything. "Marry me," Thomas said suddenly. Ayanna looked startled. "What? Marry me? If you're my wife, legally married, it might be harder for Hutchins to claim you. And even if it doesn't help with the legal problems, I want you to know that I'm committed to you and Dakota. I want us to be a real family." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure? People won't accept it easily. A white man married to a Comanche woman will face problems everywhere we go." "I don't care what other people think," Thomas said firmly. "I care about you and Dakota." If you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life taking care of both of you." Tears were flowing freely down Ayana's face now, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They kissed for the first time as the sun began to rise over the hills. It was gentle and full of promise, and Thomas felt like his heart might burst from happiness. But their moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Hutchins was back, and he'd brought more men with him this time. Thomas counted at least 6 riders as they approached the house. They were all armed, and they looked like they meant business. Thomas grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, with Ayana close behind him. "Time's up, McKenna," Hutchins called out. "I want my property, and I want it now." "She's not your property," Thomas replied. "She's going to be my wife," Hutchins laughed loudly. "Your wife? You can't marry an Indian, you fool. The law doesn't recognize marriages between whites and savages." "Then we'll change the law," Thomas said. "You'll be dead first," one of Hutchins's men said. Raising his rifle, that's when everything started happening at once. A shot rang out, but it didn't come from Hutchins's group. It came from the hill behind the house, and one of Hutchins's men fell from his horse. Then more shots came from different directions, and Thomas realized they weren't alone. His neighbors were coming over the hill on horseback, rifles in hand. There was Jim Wilson from the next ranch over, and old Pete Martinez, who ran cattle on the North Ridge. Behind them came more men that Thomas recognized from town. "Looks like you're outnumbered now, Hutchins," Jim Wilson called out as he rode. Up beside Thomas, Hutchins looked around nervously. His 6 men suddenly didn't seem like enough against the dozen armed ranchers who were surrounding them. "This is none of your business, Wilson," Hutchins said. "When a man threatens my neighbor, it becomes my business," Jim replied. "Thomas McKenna is a good man, and if he says this woman is free, then she's free." Old Pete Martinez spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "We don't take kindly to bullies around here, Hutchins. Especially bullies who threaten families." Thomas was amazed. He'd never asked these men for help, but they'd come anyway. Apparently word had spread about what was happening, and his neighbors had decided to take sides. "The law is on my side," Hutchins protested, but his voice sounded less confident now. "Which law would that be?" a new voice asked. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Reynolds riding up. Thomas's heart sank. The sheriff was known to be fair, but he also followed the letter of the law. If Hutchins really did have legal grounds to claim Ayana, the sheriff would have to support him. "Sheriff, thank God you're here," Hutchins said with relief. "This man is harboring stolen property. I have documents proving that woman belongs to me." Sheriff Reynolds dismounted and walked over to look at the papers Hutchins handed him. He studied them for several minutes while everyone waited in tense silence. Finally, the sheriff looked up. "These papers show you bought a woman at auction for $100. "That's right," Hutchins said triumphantly. "But they also show that Mr. McKenna bought her freedom from the same auctioneer for $800. The transaction was witnessed and recorded." The sheriff handed the papers back to Hutchins. "As far as I can see, Mr. McKenna owns the legal right to this woman's freedom, which means she's free to make her own choices." Hutchins's face turned red. "But she's an Indian. Indians don't have the same rights as white people." "Free people have rights, regardless of their race," the sheriff said firmly, "and according to these documents, she's free." The crowd of ranchers murmured their approval. Thomas felt relief flood through him, but he knew this wasn't over yet. "Besides," Sheriff Reynolds continued, "I understand there's going to be a wedding. Hard to claim ownership of someone's wife." Hutchins looked around at all the armed men surrounding him and seemed to realize he was beaten, at least for now. "This isn't over," he said angrily. "I'll find another way." "I'd be careful about making threats, Hutchins," the sheriff warned. "These folks seem pretty protective of their neighbors." Hutchins and his men rode away, but Thomas knew they'd be back. Men like Hutchins didn't give up easily, and they always found ways to cause trouble. But for now, Thomas and Ayana were safe. They had friends, they had love, and they had hope for the future. As their neighbors congratulated them and offered to help with the wedding preparations, Thomas realized that sometimes the most important battles weren't won with guns or laws. They were won by good people standing up for what was right. He looked at Iana, who was holding baby Dakota and smiling despite the tears on her cheeks. Soon, she would be his wife, and they would face whatever challenges came their way together. Love had found them in the most unlikely circumstances, and now it would give them the strength to build a new life together. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town. It wasn't a fancy ceremony, but it was filled with love and hope. Pastor Williams had agreed to perform the service despite some pressure from certain members of his congregation who disapproved of the union. Ayana wore a simple white dress that the local women had sewn for her. Her long black hair was braided with wildflowers, and she carried a small bouquet of autumn leaves. Thomas had never seen anyone more beautiful in his life. About half the town showed up to witness the ceremony. Some came out of genuine support, others out of curiosity, and a few probably came hoping to see trouble. But Thomas didn't care about their reasons. All that mattered was the woman standing beside him, promising to love him for the rest of their lives. "Do you, Thomas McKenna, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Pastor Williams asked. "I do," Thomas said, his voice strong and clear. "And do you, Ayana, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Ayana replied in English, though her accent made the words sound like music when they kissed to seal their marriage. Baby Dakota clapped his little hands from where Jim Wilson's wife was holding him in the front row. The congregation laughed, and even some of the skeptical faces softened into smiles. The celebration afterward was held at the Wilson Ranch, where neighbors had brought food and music. Children ran around playing games while adults talked and danced. For a few hours, it felt like the whole community had come together to celebrate love winning over prejudice. But Thomas knew the real challenges were just beginning. Over the next few months, life settled into a routine, though it wasn't always easy. Some people in town accepted the new couple, but others made their disapproval known in small, cruel ways. The general store owner would sometimes claim to be out of items that Ayana needed. Children would stare and whisper when she walked down the street. A few families stopped speaking to Thomas altogether. The worst problems came from Garrett Hutchins, who hadn't given up his campaign of harassment. He couldn't legally claim Ayana anymore, but he found other ways to make their lives difficult. First, he started spreading rumors that Thomas was harboring dangerous Indians who might attack other settlers. When that didn't work, he complained to the territorial government that the McKenna Ranch was being used as a meeting place for hostile tribes. Then came the night someone burned down their barn. Thomas woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of his horses screaming. He ran outside to see flames shooting into the sky where his barn had stood just hours before. All his winter hay was gone. Along with most of his tools and equipment, Ayana appeared beside him, holding baby Dakota, who was now walking and getting into everything. She didn't say anything, but Thomas could see the fear in her eyes. They both knew this wasn't an accident. "We can rebuild," Thomas said, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "With what money?" Ayana asked quietly. They were barely scraping by as it was. The next morning, something amazing happened. Jim Wilson showed up with a wagon full of lumber. Behind him came Pete Martinez with tools and nails. Then came more neighbors, and by afternoon, half the county was at the McKenna Ranch helping to rebuild the barn. "Nobody burns down a neighbor's barn around here," Jim Wilson said as he hammered boards into place. "Especially not good neighbors like you folks." Even some people who had been cold to them before showed up to help. Mrs. Henderson from town brought food for all the workers. The blacksmith came to repair damaged tools for free. By sunset, they had the frame of a new barn in place. "Why are you all helping us?" Ayana asked Thomas that evening as they watched their neighbors pack up their tools. "Because this is what good people do," Thomas replied. "They stand up for what's right." But Hutchins wasn't finished with them yet. A few weeks later, their cattle started getting sick. Someone had been poisoning the water in their main pasture. Thomas lost 12 head of cattle before he figured out what was happening. This time, Sheriff Reynolds got involved. He couldn't prove Hutchins was behind it, but he made it clear that any more accidents would result in serious consequences for whoever was responsible. The harassment gradually decreased, but it never completely stopped. Thomas and Ayana learned to live with the knowledge that some people would never accept them. But they also discovered that more people supported them than opposed them. Their family grew too. 2 years after their wedding, Ayana gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's green eyes, and she was the most beautiful baby Thomas had ever seen besides Dakota. 3 years later came their son, who they named Jesse. He looked more like Thomas, but had his mother's quick smile and fierce independence. Dakota, now 5 years old, had grown into a bright, curious boy who spoke both English and Comanche fluently. He could ride a horse better than most adults and knew every animal on the ranch by name. Thomas loved him as much as if he were his own blood, and Dakota called him Papa without any hesitation. The ranch prospered despite the early setbacks. Ayana had a gift for healing, using traditional Comanche remedies that often worked better than anything the town doctor could provide. Word spread, and people started coming to her for help with illnesses and injuries. Even some who had opposed their marriage began to respect her knowledge and skill. Thomas expanded their cattle herd and started breeding horses. Ayana's understanding of the land and weather patterns helped them make smart decisions about when to plant, when to harvest, and when to move the animals to different pastures. One day, about 5 years after their wedding, Thomas came home to find a surprising visitor waiting on their front porch. It was an elderly Comanche man, weathered and dignified, with silver hair braided down his back. Ayana saw him from the kitchen window and dropped the plate she was washing. She ran outside and threw her arms around the old man, speaking rapidly in Comanche through her tears of joy. "This is my grandfather," she told Thomas when she could speak English again. "I thought he was dead." The old man's name was White Eagle, and he had come looking for his granddaughter after hearing rumors that she was alive and living with a white rancher. He had expected to find her enslaved or mistreated. Instead, he found her healthy, happy, and surrounded by children who called her Mama in 2 different languages. White Eagle stayed with them for several weeks, getting to know his great-grandchildren and observing the life Ayana had built. At first, he was suspicious of Thomas, but gradually he saw how much love existed in their home. "Your husband is a good man," he told Ayana one evening in Comanche, though Thomas was learning to understand more of the language. "He treats you with respect and honors your ways." White Eagle taught the children stories from Comanche tradition and showed them skills that had been passed down through generations. In return, Thomas taught him about ranch life and shared his own family's history. When it came time for White Eagle to leave, he gave Thomas a special gift, a medicine bundle that had belonged to Ayana's father. "Your family now," the old man said in careful English. "You protect what is precious." As Thomas watched his grandfather-in-law ride away, he realized how much his life had changed since that day at the auction in Fort Worth. He'd started as a lonely rancher with cattle to sell and had somehow become the patriarch of a family that bridged 2 worlds. Their house was always full of noise and life now. Dakota would practice his reading while Hope tried to catch the barn cats, and baby Jesse crawled everywhere he wasn't supposed to go. Ayana sang traditional songs while she cooked, mixing Comanche recipes with foods Thomas had grown up eating. They faced challenges every day. Some people still whispered about them in town. Government officials sometimes questioned their right to live peacefully on their own land. There were always cattle to tend, crops to harvest, and children to raise. But when Thomas sat on his porch in the evenings, watching his wife teach their children about the stars in both English and Comanche, he knew he was the luckiest man alive. The woman he'd impulsively rescued at an auction had become his partner, his best friend, and the love of his life. The frightened, pregnant captive had grown into a strong, respected member of their community. The baby born during a thunderstorm in an abandoned cabin was now a confident young boy who served as a bridge between 2 cultures. Their love story had started with an act of justice and grown into something that challenged everyone around them to be better. They'd proven that love could overcome prejudice, that families could be built from the most unlikely circumstances, and that standing up for what's right was always worth the cost. As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Thomas McKenna smiled and counted his blessings. Sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places.